Oh, what's happening? Oh, yes! There we go.
All right. Okay, hopefully it doesn't happen again. It is risen. Okay. All right, hi. So, yeah, done another presentation for you. Hope you enjoy it. It went through a few drafts. The first couple would probably take about 5 hours to read, so there'll be so much to talk about. I've had to really cut it down and condense it. So hopefully now it should fit the time we've got. Okay, and also obviously it'll be information overload otherwise, and possibility it still will be. But yeah, if you want to take notes, maybe it's a good idea. I've really tried to make it as digestible as possible though. All right, so Easter was last week. We're still just about in the season, although the Greek Orthodox Church measures it differently, so for them today is actually Easter. So I can technically say I'm doing it on Easter Sunday. So anyway, we live in a society where Easter is somehow about chocolate eggs and rabbits that hide them. But the Christian roots of the holiday make it the most important celebration of our year. We make a big fuss about Christmas and the birth of Jesus, but Easter is about the biggest moment in human history, Jesus' death and resurrection. So we know the story. Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate under pressure from the Jewish Sanhedrin. He was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, and on the third day he rose again and returned to his disciples, and in doing so he proved that he was the Messiah he claimed to be, and showed us that he defeated death and sin. So at Easter we don't celebrate Jesus' death, we remember his sacrifice and the good news that he saved us all. It's the centre point of our faith, and as the Apostle Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. So all of our Christian faith hangs on the fact of Jesus' resurrection. If it never happened, then there's actually no reason for us to be Christians. So that brings us to today's question: why should we believe that the resurrection happened? Christianity is unique in that its truth relies on one specific historical event. So many other faiths, they've got either mysterious origins or they're based on a person who went away alone for a little while and came back talking about special revelations. And those kind of things, they can't be investigated. But Jesus had a public ministry, he had public miracles and a public execution. And that means there's plenty of witnesses that are able to verify or falsify whether it actually happened. So where do we start? Our richest source of information is obviously the New Testament. It has 4 separate biographies of Jesus' life, plus extra details that are found in all the letters to the early churches. However, non-Christians can be wary of these biblical texts, and they might accuse them of bias because they're written by Christians. But the fact is that's not actually a good objection, because all the disciples were Jews who came to trust and follow Jesus, and the Gospels are the accounts of the things that convinced them. And we've also got the Apostle Paul, who is an extreme case. He was a later convert, who was initially someone who persecuted Christians and oversaw executions. So he was an outright enemy of the faith. And then later he became one of the most influential leaders. So that change of heart, where he went from being a dangerous enemy in a position of power to putting himself in the firing line, it must have been something really drastically convincing. We also have Jesus' own brothers, James and Jude, who were not his followers until after the resurrection. So the idea that these were Christians who were knowingly writing propaganda is just not realistic. We could, in the interest of objectivity though, allow for the possibility that all the authors were mistaken in their beliefs for some reason, but I don't think we've got any reason to doubt their sincerity. With that in mind though, we can be very confident in the resurrection using evidence that even skeptics accept. So let's just remind ourselves of the basic skeleton of the gospel story. So Jesus claimed to be God. He's from Judea. He gathered followers and was teaching things that are a bit different to what people are used to. He was a miracle worker, a healer, exorcist. He taught peace and forgiveness and so on. Eventually he was accused of blasphemy by the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin. And then he was crucified and died under the eye of Pontius Pilate. He was buried respectfully, and Days later, on the third day, the tomb was found empty by some of his followers. And then following the event, there were several people who claimed to see him risen, meet him, and eat with him, talk to him. And that lasted for about 40 days. And following that, the Christian religion spread all over the world really rapidly. So we know by manuscript evidence that the whole of the New Testament was complete by the end of the 1st century, so 100 AD, the very latest, we have the whole of the Bible. So that means that this was the Christian belief from the very beginning. But what we want to know is whether this account of events matches what really happened in history. So each of these bullet points here are a historical detail that can be investigated. If we can find support for these details, then that strengthens the historical reliability of the Gospels. But in this situation, we don't need to worry about the Gospels being completely free of errors or being inspired by God's word or anything like that. We're just looking to see if we can support these specific details that make up the most important points of what the Gospel is. So there's quite a lot of bullet points here. So in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to focus on a few of the most important ones. But if you'd like to see more about the full list, I've got a video online on YouTube called The Evidence for Jesus' Existence, where I go through the lot of them. So if you want to check that out and share and subscribe, that'd be great. So going back to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 15 we find a very important piece of historical information. Okay, so now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. So there's a lot in this short passage, a lot we can take out of it. In it, Paul gives us a very quick summary of what the gospel is. Jesus died for our sins, he was raised on the third day, and then he appeared to the apostles. So what makes this specifically really important is how early this passage was put together. So the letter to the Corinthians as a whole was written about 53 AD, so that's only about 2 decades after the first Easter, which when dealing with ancient documents is very, very early. But in verses 3 to 5, Paul is quoting from an apostolic creed that comes from much, much earlier. You can see that just before the creed, Paul says he's passing on what he received. And the Greek words he used there, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, they've got like a specific meaning that refers to handing on a rabbinic tradition. So he's saying he got the creed from an authority and he's passing it on and you can trust it. And there's 2 possible places he could have received this from. In 1 Corinthians 11:23, Paul says, "For I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered unto you." And there he uses the same Greek words there as he does in the creed. So that would suggest he received the creed from Jesus himself at his conversion. The other alternative is found in Galatians 1:18-20, where about 3 years after his conversion, Paul met with Peter and James in Jerusalem, with the intent of making sure that the gospel he had was exactly the same as theirs. So either way, if Paul received the creed from Jesus or from the leading apostles, it happened within 5 years of the first Easter. So Paul would have received the creed somewhere within 3 to 5 years after Easter, which means the creed itself would be older than that. This means that the gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection was what Christians were teaching straight away. So some skeptics like to believe that the resurrection was made up decades later, but that's just not possible given the almost immediate existence of this creed. Following the creed, Paul adds more to the list of post-resurrection appearances, including himself, of course, and over 500 other people. He says that most of them are still alive, And that, if anything, is an invitation to the reader to check with the people if they've got any doubts. Okay, so we've got the long list of facts again. There's strong support for each of these points, but for now I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. So these are the core of the faith. These are the facts that can carry it, and these are the ones that Paul sums up in his creed. If these 3 facts are true, then there's some explanation that's needed for them. So what we can do first is to take a look at a few reasons why we can believe these facts, and then deal with a few possible objections to them. And at that point we should be able to see that the best explanation is the one we find in the Bible. So our first point is that Jesus was crucified and died. So this one is easy. The best and most respected scholars of biblical history all agree that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. Christians and atheists alike have found that this fact is indisputable. Considering how spotty ancient records and history in general can be, this is quite amazing. But it's not that surprising if Jesus is God and he wants the world to know about him. It's just very surprising if Jesus was the son of a carpenter from the middle of nowhere. So Jesus' crucifixion is covered in all 4 Gospels, plus some epistles. And however, skeptics prefer sources from outside of the Bible. So we're going to have a look at some neutral sources and some enemy sources. Enemy sources are great because if they say something that supports the story while they're trying to discredit it, it holds a lot of weight. So our first source is Tacitus' Annals. I'm not going to read through all of these, so if you want to take a note of the source to look up later, you can do that. Tacitus was a Roman historian documenting the 1st century. So this passage comes from a section referring to July 64 AD, when Rome mysteriously caught fire. Rumour has it that Nero himself started the fire, but whether or not that's true, he decided to use the disaster for his own political needs. So to get the blame off of himself, he put it onto the Christians. So even though this passage is only really a passing reference to Christians as they crop up in an account in Rome, it gives us a few great historical details. First off is that only 3 decades after the crucifixion, there's enough of a Christian population in Rome, which was the capital of the world at the time, that they're noticeable. And this goes to show just how quickly the message spread. We also have confirmation that Jesus lived in Judea, he was executed by Pontius Pilate, and that his followers had certain superstitions. So remember, this all comes from a Roman source, someone who had little to no interest in supporting Christian belief. Our next source comes from a Syrian pagan. His name was Marabar Serapion, I think I'm saying that right. Around 73 AD, he wrote a letter to his son, and this fragment has survived. In it, Bar Serapion refers to a wise king of the Jews who was killed after he laid down a new law. He seems to suggest that the Jews were punished for this by being driven out of their homeland over the course of the war that happened in the 60s. There isn't really anyone else besides this that this could only be referring to Jesus. So this person seems to have some sympathy for the Christian movement, given the terms he uses. However, we can be confident he's not Christian himself, given that he suggests that the way the wise king still lives is through his work, in the same way that Socrates and Pythagoras live on, not by an actual physical resurrection. The next source we'll look at is another famous Roman historian by the name of Josephus. So this is one of the best known non-Christian passages used to support the gospel. However, there's a few issues with it. Josephus, having a Jewish heritage and living as a Roman, was no friend to Christianity. Yet this passage, it's got all sorts of lovely language about Jesus being the Messiah and things like that. So it seems obvious that someone has tampered with the quote and inserted these parts. So for this reason, there are quite a lot of scholars that just kind of throw it out. Yet there's deeper digging has uncovered that although the passage was altered, some of it does actually belong in the text. And so we can trust the details that we get from the original version. A 10th century Arabic copy of the document was found that didn't have the Christian additions in it. So seeing as a Roman Jew would not be calling Jesus the Christ or the Messiah, we can look at the version that's likely to be the original. So in this version, which avoids the Christian forgeries, we still have confirmation that Jesus was executed by Pilate and had a lot of followers. It does mention the resurrection and the Messiah, but it only does that by way of telling us that this is what Christians believe, so we can't use those details as confirmations that they actually happened. Continuing with the Jewish theme, the next passage we can look at is from the Talmud. The Talmud contains several possible references to Jesus. However, a lot of them seem to be referring to events that were too early or too late, so they must have been different Jesuses, because Jesus was actually quite a common name at the time. This passage, however, looks to be very much about our Jesus. He's referred to as being from Nazareth. He was executed at Passover, and the most interesting thing is that they accuse him of sorcery. I think that the words sorcery and miracle, they're almost synonyms. The only difference is if you say miracle, you think it's a good thing. If you say sorcery, you think it's a bad thing. So it's just a case of perspective. Several of the other passages in the Talmud that reference Jesus actually mention disciples who perform healings in his name. So if they were trying to put a negative spin on it, they didn't do a great job. So having seen just a few of these sources, we find that we have accounts from Christians, Jews, Romans and pagans that all agree Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. So it's really clear to see why scholars are certain that this is historical fact. And with that, we can move on to the second point. Of these three facts, the empty tomb is probably the one that there's most debate over. However, the case for the tomb being empty is incredibly strong. And even though there are some who deny it, the majority of scholars do believe that Jesus' body was missing. So let's see a few of the reasons why. Much like the crucifixion, the empty tomb is mentioned in all four Gospels, and all four have it being discovered by women. And that's a really important detail. In Jewish culture at the time, women were not considered to be good witnesses. So the fact that one of the most important facts of the Gospels relies on what women saw, it would actually have been embarrassing to the culture. So let's see what Josephus has to say on the subject again. So Josephus tells us that women can't be trusted to tell the truth. There could be all sorts of reasons they would lie, and so they shouldn't be used as witnesses unless there's absolutely no option. So the point here is that if Jewish culture at the time did not trust the testimony of women, then it would be a bad idea to invent a story where women are your main witnesses. If you want to convince someone of a lie, then you try to say that trustworthy men were the ones that saw the event. So the Gospel of Peter, which is a late non-canon account that's got lots of legendary embellishments, does exactly that. Instead of having women find the tomb empty, as the Bible tells us what happened, the Gospel of Peter says that Jesus came out of the tomb as a giant and was seen by Roman centurions and Jewish leaders. So this is just one of the many things that suggest that the Gospel authors were not making it up. We'll see a few more later, but the New Testament is full of things that just would not be there if the Apostles' goal was to just create or invent a new attractive cult and draw in gullible people. One more of those that's relevant to the tomb is the mention of Joseph of Arimathea. All four Gospels again tell us that this member of the Jewish High Council asked to take Jesus' body and bury him in his own personal tomb. Given that throughout the Gospel story, Jesus was regularly in conflict with the Sanhedrin, and it was them who called for his execution, it makes no sense that the authors would create a council member who was on their side. So seeing as Joseph would have been a high-profile, wealthy man, it may have been fairly common knowledge where his tomb was. The Sanhedrin would, of course, known who Joseph was and whether he existed, and if he had a tomb that he could give to Jesus. So Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea, it could not have been a lie because it's far too specific and it's too easy to be refuted by the enemies. So if it's the case that Joseph of Arimathea definitely put Jesus in the tomb, that would be confirmation that Jesus' body was in there. Obviously, that's an important detail if we're talking about the empty tomb, because if he was never inside to start with, then we'd expect the tomb to be empty. But instead, what we have is this reliable information that Jesus' body was put into the tomb and that his disciples, both male and female, expected his body to be there. Josephus, again, gives us further confirmation that Jesus' body would definitely have been in the tomb. In his other book called The Wars of the Jews, Josephus tells us that Jews would always bury their dead respectfully, even if they'd been executed by crucifixion. So this lends powerful support to Jesus' burial. One of the most telling effects about the event was the Jewish response to the empty tomb and the resurrection claims by the apostles. The disciples were saying that Jesus was buried in a tomb that belonged to a member of the Sanhedrin council, and then on the third day he got up and left. The Jewish leaders could have responded in a number of ways. They could have pointed out that the empty tomb was the wrong one and that Jesus was laid in a different one and showed them the body. They could have denied that Jesus had been given permission to use his personal tomb. They could have denied that Joseph was a member of the council. But instead, they accused the disciples of stealing the body. I believe that Matthew's Gospel was written somewhere between 50 and 60 AD, though many scholars will date it later. The dialogue with Trypho was written about 160 AD. Both mention that the Jews' answer to the resurrection claim was that the disciples stole the body and they faked the whole thing. The thing is that if the Jews say that the disciples took the body, then they are admitting that Jesus' body was put into the tomb and also that the tomb was found empty. The Jews were admitting that the tomb was empty. In trying to disprove what happened, they actually give support to some of the important points in the story. So, like I said before, if your enemy says something that helps your case, then it carries more weight than someone who might have a bias towards helping you. We also have an edict of Caesar called the Nazareth Inscription, dating to about a decade after the crucifixion, and it seems to be a reaction to the empty tomb of Jesus, as it orders a death penalty for anyone removing bodies from tombs. We can be confident of the date, as the style of the edict matches that of Emperor Claudius, which would place it not much more than a decade after Easter. And we can be confident that it's talking about Jewish burials, as Roman and Greek funerals were mostly cremations, which would leave no body to steal. And we can be confident that this was a response to something significant, as there's nothing else like it in the ancient Roman world, referring to stealing bodies. Some places did have issues with grave robbing, but not actual body snatching. So in the context of there being a growing group of Christians claiming that their God had risen from the dead, which may have been seen as a threat to the authority of Rome, while the Sanhedrin were responding that the body had been stolen, it looks like this edict was a direct response to the empty tomb. And that brings us to our third statement. The disciples were convinced that they had seen Jesus alive again. In this, we have options about what happened back then. Either the Gospels are true, and Jesus really did appear to his disciples, or the Gospels are accounts of something the disciples believed, but was not really true, or the whole thing was a hoax. So, which one is it? We can rule out hoax very easily. Jesus, the supposed Messiah and Saviour, was dead. He was their leader. If Jesus had not been raised, that would leave the disciples two options. Either they go back home and get on with their lives, or they start this elaborate hoax. But the thing is, when people set up scams, they normally have some kind of motive to do so. So it might be some money or fame or power or something like that. Money, fame, power or sex are generally the categories that everything fits under. So let's have a look at the Apostle Paul. Click. Thanks. He claimed to have personally seen the risen Christ, and that began his mission proclaiming the gospel. Before that, though, he was a Pharisee. He was in a position of authority, leading a persecution of Christian people, overseeing their executions, and was well respected in his community. He studied under one of the most famous rabbis of all time. He had power, money, and fame. He was celibate and had no interest in marriage. When he became Christian, he gave up all the things that someone involved in a scam would actually be chasing after. He gave up his status and his authority and his respected position. He remained celibate and never married. The only thing he gained was beatings and imprisonment and eventually a death by beheading. Paul was not the only one to be sent to his death because of the gospel. Tradition has it that all except John were executed. Historical sources are a little sketchy for some of them, but we do have good reason to believe that as well as Paul, the early martyrs were Peter, James the Great, Stephen the first martyr, and James the brother of Jesus. That group includes the leader of the apostles, plus probably the second in command, as well as Paul, who was originally hostile to the faith, and James, who was not a believer until after Easter. What all these have in common is that they personally claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. So they claimed it, and they went to their deaths for that claim. If it had been a hoax, you'd think that at least one of them would have given up on the lie rather than die for it. What we can also take from the fact that some of the apostles died is that we can be sure that the rest were willing to die for their belief. They could see the potential consequences for continuing with what they were doing. So even though we do not have historical confirmation of all the martyrdoms, we can be sure that the apostles were at least willing to be martyrs. So we've established that the apostles had no motives to create a hoax, and that the idea that they would all be willing to die for a lie that they gain nothing from is impossible. It can't be that option. But I'll just quickly here skim some other things to consider. Earlier I mentioned that there were some things in the Gospels that made no sense to be made up or invented. Oh, this is a sort of quote about conspiracies, mentioning Watergate. Watergate was a conspiracy. It was some of the most important people in the country, and it came out within a matter of weeks. And compared to the resurrection, where you've got a bunch of fishermen who've got no power, nothing going for them, and they managed to keep a conspiracy for their entire lives? No, we don't think so. Okay, so next one. We said that female witnesses and Joseph of Arimathea could not be made up details. Those are just two, but there are many more, and I'm not even covering them all here. So my point with this is that if the disciples were trying to create a hoax to attract gullible people to join a cult and be taken advantage of, they did a lot of things that just wouldn't have worked. But it did work, so that doesn't really add up. So trying to convince people to give up lifelong held beliefs is hard enough. The disciples would have been making it a whole lot tougher for themselves by inventing a faith that was actually unattractive. And they offered nothing to those who would join. There's no prosperity gospel, no promises to solve the problems in their lives. They only offered the truth. And we can believe that the apostles would die for the truth, and we can believe that the apostles would die for something that they thought was true. But the idea that they would die for what they knew was a lie is just crazy. We can be sure that the apostles believed in what they preached. They were not attempting a worldwide scam. The question then remains whether they were mistaken or if they were telling the truth. So that sums up our three facts of history. The historical data we have is enough to have certainty of these three things: Jesus' death, his empty tomb, and the disciples' belief in what had happened. So the next question is, what's the best explanation of these three facts? We've seen that the Gospels and non-Christian historians agree on these facts here, so it's very reasonable to accept these as historical truth. This is what is known as the minimal facts argument. We've taken historical data that every reasonable person accepts, and we're making a case from it. So, for example, we have to accept Jesus was a real person because so many historians talk about him being a real person. We have to accept he was executed because so many people write about how he was killed, and they include details that make it unmistakable. We have to accept the empty tomb because the first century Jews who are against Christianity told us there was an empty tomb. And there's not really any reasonable way to wriggle out of accepting any of these facts. Also, being extra fair here by saying that anything supernatural, for now, they're just claims. We're leaving it open to the possibility that the disciples, they were mistaken, or they were lying, or whatever. But what we have to do now is figure out if it makes sense that they were making it up, or does it make sense that they were lying? Or does it make sense that they were telling the truth? And so, we can look at a number of theories of how all these historical facts fit together. First theory, quite simply, Gospels are true. Very straightforward. Jesus lived, had his ministry, accused of blasphemy for showing himself to be equal to God, crucified, resurrected. Followers all saw this, and they went on to spread the good news around the world. If the Gospels are true, then all these facts are explained perfectly. However, one of the strengths of the minimal facts argument is that it doesn't need the Gospels to be true. The Gospel books could have all sorts of errors in them, because we're only basing our case on these accepted facts here. So if someone was to ask something about the confusing bit about the saints rising in Matthew, it's irrelevant to what we're looking at here. It doesn't make a difference to the historical facts we have and the explanation about who Jesus was and who he said he was. So that just becomes a question that we can figure out later. So, okay, how about some alternative theories? Non-believers need something to explain these facts. It's a real problem for them because, as we've seen, these details are historical facts, and so they actually happened, and so there must be a reason for them. And if non-believers can't find an explanation for this series of events, there's a big issue in their worldview, and they're basically relying on blind faith, hoping that Jesus wasn't who he said he was. Because, look, if Jesus was who he said he was God in the flesh, coming to earth, and doing the most significant thing in history. And then that started a domino effect that has made Jesus the most influential person in history. If he wasn't who he said he was, then he was the son of a carpenter from a backwater village who somehow fooled the world despite being killed after only 3 years of preaching. They have to explain how it's possible for someone so insignificant to become so important. So a popular theory, which we mentioned already today, was that the disciples stole the body and faked the resurrection. And this would explain why the tomb was empty. However, first thing to note is it doesn't explain the other things. It doesn't explain much else. The records tell us that the disciples didn't understand Jesus' death until he had come back. When he died, they were ready to give up and go home. They weren't expecting Jesus to be back, and they were shocked when it happened. But the bigger issue is that even if the disciples had decided to fake the resurrection, they were going to have difficulty convincing anyone that it actually happened. If they couldn't show people the risen Jesus, then why should anyone believe him that he'd come back? And this especially counts for James and Jude, the brothers of Jesus. They'd not believed in him before the crucifixion, so it made no sense for them to have a change of heart unless he stood in front of them. And they were his brothers who he grew up with. So that they weren't going to be fooled if it was some imposter in his place. And this would very much count for Paul as well. He was a Christian persecutor. He oversaw executions. He was in a position of power and authority among the Pharisees. However, he said he met Jesus, and he was so convinced that he should give up all that he had and become one of the persecuted people. So his conversion makes absolutely no sense unless he truly believed. So this is beginning to go over ground we've already covered. One of the biggest problems with suggesting that an explanation of the empty tomb was that the disciples stole Jesus' body. And that contradicts fact number 3. If the disciples had stolen the body, they would not truly believe the message they were spreading. But we know that they did believe, so they couldn't have stolen the body. If the apostles had stolen the body, they would know that the resurrection did not happen, and they would not have been able to convince Jesus' brothers, and they would not have been able to convince one of their greatest enemies. Besides that, there's all sorts of logistical problems stealing the body. It would kind of make it impossible anyway. It would have taken quite a few of them to do it. The tomb had a huge boulder over the front that would take several men to pull it out. It rested in a groove, so they need to kind of lift it out. And they'd have to sneak into the tomb, remove it, take the body, sneak out again, put the boulder back, and do all this without being noticed. And Matthew's Gospel tells us that the tombs are actually being guarded, so they have to do all of that with nobody noticing. We're also told that the burial linen was left neatly folded, which is hardly likely to have been done by desperate men trying to avoid discovery. Scholars have come to the conclusion that the disciples stealing the body is very unlikely. They had no motive, they would not have physically been able to do it, and they would have spent the rest of their lives at risk of torture and death for the sake of something that they knew was not true. On top of that, we would need an extra theory that explains how the early church expanded so quickly, if it was based on the lie. The third theory we will take a look at is probably the next most popular. There's many skeptics who believe that all of the resurrection appearances of Jesus were hallucinations. They believed that because the disciples were so grief-stricken, they were easily tricked by their own wishful thinking and dreams. However, this theory has huge problems. Firstly, hallucinations are individual experiences. There are no cases of shared hallucinations where several different people see the same thing at different times in different places. Secondly, the hallucinations only make sense when talking about the disciples. They don't make much sense in reference to Jesus' non-believing brothers. They definitely don't make sense for Paul. So for this theory to work, there would have to be several extremely vivid hallucinations seen by various people, from Jesus' closest friends to his enemies. And these hallucinations would all have had to be convincing enough that the people seeing them would have no doubt that Jesus appeared to them. Generally, when people hallucinate, they might believe what they're seeing while it's happening, but after the fact, most of the time people come to their senses and they realise it wasn't real. But the Bible tells us that Jesus was a physical presence. He walked and spoke with his friends, he sat and ate with them, they touched his wounds, he appeared to multiple people at the same time, and none of that can be done by hallucination. And of course there's the issue of him staying with them for 40 days. Hallucinations tend to not last much more than maybe a few hours at most. So in short, the hallucination theory is also impossible. On top of that, it does absolutely nothing to explain the empty tomb. And so if it was the hallucinations, there still needs to be another explanation to explain the empty tomb and like where had Jesus' body gone. So these are the leading theories for what happened. As you can see, only one of them actually explains the facts. There are other theories, but they're even weaker than the ones I've covered. So swoon theory, for example, suggests that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He just fainted, and so he was able to just get up a couple of days later. But I mean, that's obviously nonsense, because the Romans were very good at their jobs at being executioners. And they double-checked he was dead before taking him down by shoving a big spear in his side. Even if somehow he was alive at that point, it's unlikely he would have survived in the tomb for days as he bled out and dehydrated. So even if he had survived the crucifixion and days wrapped in the tomb, he just wouldn't be convincing as a resurrected, glorified being if he was covered head to toe in scourge marks and stab wounds and whatever else. Then there are some who don't believe in God, who might say it was aliens with highly advanced technology. They did it. So, I mean, there's obvious problems with that. It's what we say is ad hoc. It's just like within the context of the events, the gospel story, it fits the narrative. Jesus claimed to be God, he claimed to be the Messiah, and so the resurrection verified his claims. And it's a series of events that make sense with a broad context. But it will be a really strange coincidence if Jesus said all these things, claimed all these things, and then was just coincidentally, he was the only person in history to be brought back to life by extraterrestrial intervention. And then you have to believe aliens exist, and that they have the ability to travel here without being detected. They have the ability to raise people from the dead, and that they will do it for just one person in history and not make themselves known to anybody else. And the one time they do it, it becomes the most important thing of all time, and it's like one big prank, like the ultimate pranksters. It just doesn't fit the context at all. So our best, and really the only explanation of the facts that we can gather from history, is that the resurrection really happened. The alternatives just aren't plausible. So we've looked at some historical sources that support the gospel narrative. We've looked at some alternative explanations and found that they're not very good. But wouldn't it be nice if Jesus had done all this in a more modern era, where we have cameras and can record things and have real proof? Well, I think he went one better than that. So, bringing this up, maybe I've lost a few of you, but I think the Shroud of Turin could well be one of the most important historical artefacts that we have. I'm going to whiz through this bit, but if you want to know more, you can look up a guy called Gary Habermas. So, I think we're all really familiar with what the shroud is said to do. This is apparently the linen that Jesus was wrapped in the tomb. His bloodstains have left an image on the shroud that we can see today. So last Sunday, Tom was talking about Peter discovering the linen in the tomb.
He said that Peter finding the linen was an obvious clue that Jesus' body had not been stolen, because if it had been grave robbers, then A, one thing they would have wanted would be the linen, and B, grave robbers probably wouldn't want to carry around a corpse that wasn't wrapped. Anyway, the linen or the shroud. The first curious thing about it is that no other shroud like it exists. Finding burial cloths with full images of the corpse just doesn't happen. Then, of course, we have the amazing details that show this could only have been Jesus. There's whip marks all over the body. There's a wound in the side that looks like he's been pierced by a spear. There are wounds in the wrists where nails would have been hammered for crucifixion. There's even marks around the forehead that are consistent with a thorny crown. It's Jesus. Whether it's real or it's a forgery, it's definitely Jesus. So most people do believe it's a forgery. I don't know, maybe some of you do too. And this is generally based on a carbon dating test that was done in 1988 that concluded that it was it was made in medieval times. So for most people, that's it, that's the end of the story. However, it seems that the piece that was carbon dated was probably actually taken from a repair patch that was added after the shroud had been in a fire, because the piece they tested was made of cotton, whereas the shroud is made of linen. So that 1988 test is the only evidence we have for the medieval date. And seeing as that evidence is in question, we probably don't want to hang our conclusion on it. What people don't often hear about are the other tests that have been done on the shrouds. And every other test had results that are consistent with a 1st century date. In 2013, a test using infrared dated the shroud to anywhere between 300 BC and 400 AD. So that's not amazingly precise, but it's a lot earlier than the medieval date. In the 70s, scientists examining the cloth discovered various types of pollen on it. Some of the pollen was from Europe, which would be expected because it was taken and displayed there for so many years, but some was from a specific type of plant that was only found in Israel around Jerusalem. And the layering of the pollen informed them that the shroud was in Europe after it originally came from Israel. So the way that the shroud was weaved is consistent with 1st century methods and not medieval methods. Possibly, most importantly, is the coins on the eyes. They're leptons of Pontius Pilate, which have been minted between 29 and 31 AD. An interesting detail is that there's a little spelling error on the coin as well. It was compared to a real coin, Pontius Pilate lepton, and the error is on both, which shows that the coin is accurate. Not something they would have known in medieval times, probably. So there's all this, and it all seems to give us a very specific date and a place of around 30 AD in Jerusalem, which is what we'd expect if it was real. If it was a medieval fake, we aren't seeing things we would expect. A medieval forger wouldn't have known to sprinkle Israeli pollen onto the cloth. They probably wouldn't have been accurate with the coin. And there are bigger issues with the idea of forgery. Firstly, many attempts have been made to recreate the shroud, and no one's been able to do it using either ancient methods or modern methods. It's been found that the image on the shroud is like a photo negative. So although it doesn't look like a face normally, when it's treated by a negative, a much clearer face appears. So that's, again, something medieval forgers would not know how to do. And the negative is so detailed that they've been able to use it to make a 3D model of Jesus, which, I mean, if you put a painting into one of these 3D scanners, they can't do it with a painting. So there's something really special about how this has been done. So, like I say, they found no way to reproduce this type of image with any known methods. And they discovered that the image was made by a form of ultraviolet radiation. But the amount of radiation required is more than any technology that we've produced, we've made. It will take several billion watts blasted at only a fraction of a second. And because I want to be brief on this bit, I'll just get to the point. If the Shroud of Turin really was Jesus' burial linen, what we have here is a photograph of the resurrection taken almost 2,000 years before cameras were invented. So it's a bonus miracle on top of the most important miracle in history. So there's a lot more evidence, including stuff about how the shroud influenced art for the next few centuries and more sciencey stuff too. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to look up the work of Gary Habermas. He's written a lot on the shroud and the resurrection evidence. He's got his own website, and you can see several talks from YouTube. And also for the subject of the resurrection, I'd recommend Dr. William Lane Craig and Michael O'Connor. There's lots of people you can look up, but I think these are among the best. I've got their book here. It's jointly written by these two. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you've got any questions, I can do my best to answer them, but I'm not 100% that I know everything.